40 people go completely silent the moment you arrive screaming into the world. You are 3 minutes old, slicked in blood and ash, and every face in this camp is locked on you, deciding. Your mother's hands are shaking as she lifts you toward the smoke hole, and somewhere outside, a wolf answers your first cry like it has been waiting. Nobody in this circle knows yet whether you are a miracle or a disaster, and that question will follow you for years. Tusk is there too, wide-eyed in the back of the crowd, already leaning in to get a closer look. Here is what we actually want to know. How did a single ancient human life unfold? Season by brutal season, decade by hard decade, from that first screaming breath to the last? Because the honest answer does not just fill in a gap in your history. It rebuilds the whole picture of what a human life is supposed to feel like, and why yours still carries so many echoes of theirs. What if the most dangerous day of your entire ancient life was the very first one? It sounds like a dramatic setup, but the numbers make it uncomfortably literal. Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee ran the demographic modeling in 2004, publishing in PNAS, and what they found should stop you cold. Roughly 40 to 50% of people in Paleolithic populations never reached age 15. Not adulthood, 15. The neonatal threshold effect is the name researchers use for this brutal bottleneck, the point where survival rates collapsed hardest and earliest, right at the doorstep of life itself. Now, here is the objection you are probably already forming. Wasn't ancient life somehow more natural, more in tune, more the way humans were meant to live? The honest answer is yes, in some ways. And also, half the children died before they were old enough to lose a tooth. Nature is not a wellness retreat. It is a filter. And for most of human history, it filtered hardest on the smallest and newest among you. This matters because it completely reframes what community meant. Every birth in a Paleolithic group was a statistical long shot, a coin flip weighted toward loss, and everyone around that newborn knew it on some wordless level. Survival was not a personal achievement. It was a collective project. The people who stayed close, who kept the fire, who carried the sick infant an extra mile rather than falling behind, those people are the reason you exist right now watching this sentence. There is something almost vertiginous about that. You are not the product of easy odds. You are the product of deliberate effort made by people whose names nobody remembers, in places whose names nobody recorded, during nights that were genuinely frightening in ways a modern camping trip does not simulate. The neonatal threshold effect is not ancient trivia. It is the engine behind every human instinct you have toward protecting the vulnerable. The way a crying infant cuts through a noisy room. The way strangers on a train all look up at once when a child falls. Your nervous system learned that lesson over hundreds of thousands of years of losing and trying again. Ancient life was not idyllic. It was costly, and the cost was paid in children, and the people who survived it did so because others chose to help. Every ancient human life began as a long shot. Everyone that made it was an act of communal will. If you did survive infancy, the question becomes who was watching over you, and for how long, which is exactly where the grandmother effect begins. You are a child, and you are expensive. Not in a rude way, just biologically, embarrassingly, verifiably expensive. You cannot feed yourself. You cannot read the weather. You cannot tell a safe mushroom from a fatal one. And this helplessness will last, by the standards of any other primate, an almost insulting amount of time. A chimpanzee is mostly independent by age 5. You need more than twice that, minimum. Someone has to cover the gap. Here is where the story flips on you. You might assume that gap was covered by your parents, the people who made you, who presumably have the strongest evolutionary stake in your survival. Reasonable. Obvious. Wrong. The anthropologist Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah formalized the grandmother hypothesis in 1997, and her argument is quietly devastating. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, it was post-menopausal women, grandmothers, whose foraging effort most reliably predicted whether young children ate enough and survived. Not mothers who were busy with infants. Grandmothers. Women evolution had, by any naive account, already finished with. They were the ones keeping you alive. Hawks ran the numbers on tuber digging and weight gain in Hadza children, and the correlation held up like bedrock. The grandmother forages more, the grandchild grows faster. It is so straightforward it almost feels like you should have guessed it. You did not guess it. Nobody guessed it for most of human history, which is exactly the kind of thing Tusk would note with one slow, approving nod and nothing else. Now, here is the cascade. Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee, comparing tooth wear across thousands of fossil specimens in 2004, found something striking. Older adults, individuals who survived well past reproductive age, became dramatically more common only in Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens, spiking around 30,000 years ago. Before that, almost nobody got old. After that, old people were suddenly everywhere, and so was everything else we call human culture. The knowledge that grandmothers carry, which berries will kill you when the elk return, how to read ice that looks safe but is not. That knowledge requires decades to accumulate and a living body to transmit it. An elder pauses, squints at the horizon for what feels like an uncomfortable amount of time, and says with total authority, "The land already told you. You just weren't listening." The child has no idea what this means. The elder, honestly, is reconstructing it in real time. It has never once been wrong. What this means is almost too large to say plainly. Human childhood is so long and so costly that it required the invention of a whole new life stage, old age, just to fund it. We didn't get grandmothers because we lived longer. We lived longer because grandmothers worked. The Allocare longevity cascade runs in both directions at once, each generation extending the next. But how long was that childhood, really? And was it as slow and tender as we assume, which is exactly what Faster Children intends to find out? So if ancient children grew up faster, doesn't that make them less human? Not more? Actually, it makes the question of what childhood is far more interesting than you thought. Here's why it matters. The length of your childhood is not some fixed law of nature, like the boiling point of water. It is a bargain your species struck, and it costs something real. Donald Reed and colleagues analyzed the dental growth rings, perikymata, the tiny enamel lines that record each week of tooth formation, like a tree's rings record each year. In Neanderthal, children recovered from Krapina, Croatia. Those children were hitting adult dental maturity noticeably faster than modern children do. Not a little faster. Measurably, systematically faster, readable right there in the tooth. The Krapina children were already ahead of you before they lost their first molar. Meanwhile, Hallie Buckley and colleagues used nitrogen isotope ratios preserved in ancient teeth to estimate weaning age among Paleolithic foragers at roughly 2.5 to 3 years, which sounds tender until you realize modern industrial children often nurse far shorter, and hunter-gatherer children today frequently nurse past 4. The numbers move around depending on who you study, and the honest answer is that the isotope signal captures a range, not a single date stamped on every child. Still, the direction is clear enough. Childhood as a long, protected, slow-burning developmental runway is not the ancient default. It is the recent experiment. Tusk, presented with this finding, squinted at the horizon for a long and pointed moment before saying, "The land already told you. You just weren't listening." The child being briefed had absolutely no idea what this meant. Tusk possibly didn't either, but the tone was, as always, completely convincing. The mechanism at the center of all this is ontogenetic deceleration reversal, the evolutionary ratchet that, step by step, stretched the juvenile phase longer, pushing adult competence further down the calendar. Each generation that lingered a little longer in childhood had more time inside a social group before being asked to carry it, more time watching, more time being fed by others, while your brain, which burns roughly 20% of your body's energy at peak growth, finished its slow construction. It is a deliberate, costly, and surprisingly recent evolutionary bargain that your ancestors paid forward. And it sets up everything waiting for you in cave children, where, once a child began to linger longer in youth, you start to wonder what exactly they were doing with all that extra time. So the long childhood is real, and it's yours. But that's not the strange part. The strange part is what children were doing inside it. Not waiting, not watching from the edge of the fire, but standing shoulder to shoulder with adults in the most charged spaces their world contained. Around 36,000 years ago, deep inside Chauvet Cave in southern France, someone lifted a 3-year-old toward a wall of soft limestone and let them press a small hand into it. That handprint is still there. Jean Clotz, who spent years documenting the cave's art, confirmed that children as young as 3 participated in whatever was happening in those chambers. Not as spectators dragged along, but as hands-on contributors to something the adults clearly considered important enough to do underground by firelight, far from the entrance, which is, by most measures, the opposite of dropping your kid in front of something to keep them quiet. This matters because it means culture was not broadcast at children. It was practiced with them. Intergenerational ritual transmission is the mechanism here. The living, repeated, hands-on handoff of meaning across age groups, where the youngest bodies are already part of the ceremony before they could possibly understand why. Imagine inheriting a religion before you speak in full sentences. Actually, you probably did. Everyone's first theology is mostly vibes. Then there's the Divja Babe flute, carved in Slovenia, perhaps 60,000 years ago from the leg bone of a cave bear. Disputed as Neanderthal-made, so take this with appropriate scholarly salt, but take it, suggesting that communal music was a technology people were already maintaining across seasons and generations, long before Chauvet's children were pressing palms into cave walls. Music is extremely hard to transmit alone. It requires someone to play it for you first. The elder, of course, never explains the song directly. You ask how it goes. The elder squints at the tree line for an uncomfortable stretch of time, then says the rhythm was always there. You nod. You have absolutely no idea what this means. Somehow you remember every note. Children were not the audience of ancient culture. They were initiates, active carriers of meaning, the living bridge across which everything too important to write down was passed, because nothing was written down yet. Every gesture, every handprint, every held note was training someone smaller to hold the world's shape steady, which raises the obvious question for what the adults were marking on their own bodies and bones, and that is exactly where the painted self begins. The painted self. Semiotic body inscription, meaning you take your own skin and turn it into a sentence your whole group can read. 75,000 years before Instagram, a human being looked at their own reflection and decided they needed to be more vivid. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers Francesco Derrico and Christopher Henshelwood found ochre ground and applied with enough consistency to rule out accident. This was not someone who spilled lunch. This was someone making a deliberate mark on a body so that other bodies would know something important about it. You are looking at the oldest known sentence, and it is written in red pigment on skin. Here is what makes that sentence matter. A group that must trust you to survive cannot afford to guess who you are. Trust takes time, and in a world where the wrong stranger could empty your food cache or vanish during the hunt, you needed a faster signal than waiting around to check someone's references. The body became the resume. Not vanity, identity. Not decoration, data. Tusk, for the record, would point out that this is exactly what tattoos still do at job interviews, just with more mixed results. Fast forward roughly 50,000 years, and the same logic is still running, now carved in stone and ivory. The Gravettian Venus figurines scattered across Europe from Spain to Russia between about 28,000 and 22,000 years ago deliberately emphasize pregnancy and the mature female body. Not idealized youth, not warrior posture, but the specific, legible stages of a human life cycle. Someone was marking biological status the way a uniform marks rank. Your body, in other words, was not just yours. It was a calendar that the group needed to read at a glance. The elder squints at the horizon when asked why. "The land already told you," she says. "You just weren't listening." The child holding the small carved figure has absolutely no idea what this means. The elder, carving the next one by firelight, suspects she might not either, but the figurines keep working, so she keeps carving. What both the ochre at Blombos and the Venus figures share is this. The body was the first agreed-upon symbol system, long before any wall or bone got scratched. Marking yourself was the original act of saying, "I belong to something." And that belonging was what kept you alive through the winter. The impulse was never shallow. It was structural, as load-bearing as any roof. Which is why, if the body was a calendar of identity, the next question is what ancient people were reading in the sky above them. And that is exactly where counting the moon begins. You've probably looked at a scratched-up bone and thought, someone dropped this, or sharpened a blade on it, or was just bored. Fair. Skeptics make exactly that case. The notches at Abri Blanchard could be tally marks, tool-sharpening grooves, or idle decoration, and calling them a lunar calendar might say more about us than about them. But here's what changes the picture. When Harvard researcher Alexander Marshak spent the 1970s examining those 30,000-year-old notched bones under a microscope, he found something a random scraper doesn't produce. Groupings that shift in a rhythm matching the phases of the moon, month after month, made by different tools at different times, suggesting someone returned to the bone repeatedly to keep a record going. Not one bored afternoon, a sustained project. That distinction matters enormously. Cognitive calendrical notation, the deliberate act of marking time on an object so your future self can read it, is not decoration. It is the first externalized memory. Your phone's calendar works on the same principle. You trust a mark you made yesterday to tell tomorrow you what to do. These people were doing that with flint on bone, and they were doing it well. Then there is the Lossel Venus, carved around 25,000 years ago from a limestone block in the Dordogne, and she is holding something specific, a bison horn bearing exactly 13 notches. Marshak read those notches as a lunar or menstrual calendar, 13 being the number of full moons, give or take, in a year. The figure raises the horn toward her face, which is either profound or the world's oldest case of someone checking their phone at dinner, depending on your mood. Tusk, for his part, stared at the reconstruction for a long moment, then said simply, "She already knew." Nobody asked him to elaborate. Whether Marshak was right in every detail remains genuinely contested, and honest scholars will tell you the line between notation and decoration is blurry at this distance. But the pattern of return, different tool angles, different pressure, same bone, is hard to explain as accident. Here is what it means. The moment a human scratched a mark on the Abri Blanchard bone to remember what the moon would do next, they stepped outside the present and began to architect a future. That is not a small thing. That is the birth of planning itself. And if individuals were tracking months, what happened when whole communities had to coordinate movement and survival across an entire year, which is exactly the territory of seasonal migration. So you've established that humans were tracking time. But that's not the strange part. The strange part is that time, for most of human history, wasn't something you measured. It was somewhere you went. This is transhuman's life structuring, and it means exactly what it sounds like if you say it slowly enough to feel slightly ridiculous. You organize your entire life around moving through the landscape with the seasons, and the landscape in return feeds you. The calendar isn't a grid, it's a mountain range. You know it's spring because your feet are already moving uphill. Here's where it gets personal. Ötzi the Iceman died around 3,300 BCE in the Italian Alps, preserved so well that scientists could read his bones like a receipt. Isotope analysis, essentially reading the chemical signature of different altitudes baked into his teeth and tissue, shows he spent different seasons at different elevations, moving livestock up in summer and returning to lower ground before winter closed the passes. He was doing transhumans herding. He was, in the most literal sense, a man with a seasonal commute, except his commute involved glaciers, and he did not have a podcast. Tusk, who has heard about Ötzi before, notes that the man carried 14 different types of plant material and a copper axe, suggesting that even 5,000 years ago, people overpacked. Across the Atlantic and roughly 4,800 years later, Brian Hayden's excavations at Keatley Creek in British Columbia found pit house villages that swelled every year around the salmon runs, with winter storage pits holding enough dried fish to carry communities through the cold months. The site is about 1,500 years old, and the pattern is unmistakable. People weren't wandering. They were following a script the landscape had written, returning to the same creek at the same turn of the year, generation after generation. Ask any child near Keatley Creek, in any era, when the salmon arrive, and the elder will pause, squint at the river for an uncomfortably long time, and say with complete authority, "The land already told you. You just weren't listening." The child has no idea what this means. The elder isn't entirely sure either. The salmon, however, arrive on schedule. What this means for you right now is significant. Your ancestors didn't observe the seasons from inside a warm room. They inhabited them. The year was not a concept. It was a route. And when enough people began walking that route together, coordinating movement across dozens of miles and dozens of families, you start to wonder what kind of impossible things they began to build, which is exactly the question that opens monument builders. Collective seasonal convergence. That's the mechanism. The moment when scattered bands, following the same animals across the same landscape on the same rough schedule, arrive at the same place at the same time every year, like clockwork. Except the clock is a mountain and the hands are elk. Here's why it matters. For most of human history, you don't have a boss, a calendar, or a city council. What you have is a season, and the season is non-negotiable. Around 11,600 years ago, at a ridge in what is now southeastern Turkey, hundreds of hunter-gatherers, people with no farms, no surplus grain, no political authority anyone could enforce, dragged limestone pillars weighing up to 10 tons into careful circles. Klaus Schmidt spent nearly 2 decades excavating Göbekli Tepe, and what he found rewrote the story. The workers didn't live there. They showed up, built, and left. Then they came back. The structure wasn't a city. It was a seasonal meeting point, and collective seasonal convergence is why it exists at all. You, arriving at Göbekli Tepe for the 3rd consecutive autumn, are not a citizen. You're a regular. Now here's where the body keeps the receipts. Clark Spencer Larson's bioarchaeological analysis of skeletons at Çatalhöyük, a settlement roughly 7,400 years old, also in Turkey, found healed fractures in adults consistent with seasonal heavy-load labor, repeated year after year. The bones literally show the schedule. Stress, recovery, stress, recovery, written in calcium the way a tree writes drought years into its rings. These people weren't working constantly. They were working hard in bursts, resting and doing it again, which is, if you think about it, exactly the rhythm a seasonal convergence demands. Ask an elder when the labor season begins, and she squints at the horizon for an uncomfortable stretch of silence, then says with the full weight of her years, "The land already told you. You just weren't listening." The child at her side has no idea what this means. Neither does she entirely, but the healed fractures in her left arm confirm she has never once shown up late. What this means is uncomfortable if you're attached to the story of civilization as origin. Large-scale human cooperation didn't begin with kings or laws or surplus harvests. It may have begun with a ridge, a season, and the simple fact that you and 300 strangers kept showing up to the same place because the animals did too. Which raises the question, after a life of labor, season after season, what happened when the body finally gave out? And did anyone remember you? You are standing at the mouth of Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, and someone has just placed flowers on a body in the dirt. That someone was a Neanderthal. The body belonged to one of their own. The year was roughly 60,000 years ago, which is not a typo. When Ralph Solecki excavated Shanidar Cave between 1951 and 1960, his team found something that stopped the conversation cold. Dense pollen clusters from at least 8 flowering plant species gathered around one burial in a pattern too concentrated to be accidental. Groundsel, grape hyacinth, hollyhock, plants that bloom in spring and early summer, plants that had to be carried there on purpose. Skeptics argue wind or burrowing rodents could explain the pollen, and honestly, that argument deserves respect. But if even half the evidence holds, a Neanderthal stood over a grave in what is now Iraq and made a decision. This moment needs marking. That is mortuary temporal consciousness, the understanding that a life has a last season and that the end of it is worth a ceremony. Here is why that wrecks you. It means the awareness of mortality, the sense that time moves in arcs from birth to death, may predate Homo sapiens entirely. The elder squints at the horizon. The land already told you. You just weren't listening. 60,000 years later, around 1550 BCE, Egyptian physicians were writing the Ebers Papyrus, a medical document so comprehensive it includes separate remedies for childhood fevers, menstrual pain, and the swollen joints of old age. A pharmacopoeia organized essentially by life stage. Someone had mapped the human body across time and decided each season of it deserved its own medicine. That is not instinct. That is a philosophy. Even the word season carries the weight. It comes from the old French saison, which comes from the Latin sationem, meaning sowing time. The moment you put something in the ground and wait to see what grows. Agriculture handed us a clock, and we pressed it against our own lives until the metaphor became the meaning. You are born, you grow, you are harvested. Every carved notch on bone, every flower placed in cold earth, every remedy for an elder's aching knee is an answer to the same stubborn question. How do you make a finite life matter? The ceremonies are not denial. They are the argument. So if the last season was always known, if grief and ritual and medicine were humanity's oldest technologies, what did we build with that knowledge, and who was keeping count? You are back in the camp now, and someone is holding a child up toward a smoke hole in a hide roof. And outside, somewhere in the dark, a wolf answers. The child is screaming. You know something now that you didn't know at the open. The 40 people going silent around that child are not just waiting to see a miracle or a disaster. They are the library. They are the count. Every elder who survived to 35 carries a map inside them, of bad winters, of safe routes, of where the herd turns. And that map is what makes the silence mean something instead of nothing. One life was never just one life. It was the whole group's best argument that survival could be learned, stored, and handed forward. So what does it mean that we are still, right now, doing exactly the same thing, and that the smoke hole has just changed shape?